Hi, in this video I'm going to demonstrate how we can add listeners on the fly to running key containers without having the need to redeploy the k-jars or the project with the references or the definition to the process or the task event listeners. Let's assume a situation where we have thousands of process instances that are currently active and running in an environment like production system where we have to attach a certain event listeners to those process instances without going for a redeployment of the k-jar. As you know, the easiest way by which the process or the task event listeners could be attached to a specific project is by specifying the event listeners in the deployment descriptor at the project level. But the biggest problem with this approach, where we have when we have multiple instances that are currently being active, is that this definition, adding a definition here and doing a redeployment, would create a different container, and what will happen is the defined event listeners would get attached only to those process instances that are going to be created as a part of this new deployment. So the old deployment, which contains the currently active process instances, will still not be able to attach themselves to the event listeners that we would be defining here. Now, how do we solve this problem? So one of the easiest ways by which this particular problem could be solved is by using something called as the server level or the global level deployment descriptor. So if we go to the jBPM documentation, we find a section here on the deployment descriptors, wherein there is a clear specification on something called as server level deployment descriptor. So I highly encourage you to read this section to get a better understanding of what this server level deployment descriptor means, and also the different levels, the other different levels where we can define the deployment descriptors. So coming back to this demonstration, so let's assume that we are having multiple process instances for this particular project. So what we can do is let's go to the let's prepare the environment in such a way that we are going to have multiple process instances that are currently in active state. So I'm just doing a build and deployment, a build and deploy of this particular project. Okay, so there is already a deployment of this particular project which is in running state, so that's fine. So we can just go ahead and start creating process instances. So let's create a process instance here. Let's do a start, again a start. So now we have 3 process instances which are currently in active state, and let's go into one of the instances just to see what exactly is the process definition. How does it look like? So it's a very simple process definition which has a start and an end with a human task in between. So the process instances are waiting for a human intervention, for a human to actually complete the task so that it can go forward. So this actually simulates a situation where we have instances that are currently in active state, and we would like to attach event listeners to these process instances. Not just these, but any other new process instances that could even be started on this particular version of the key container, or any other key containers as well. So the first step towards achieving this is to define the deployment descriptor, the server level deployment descriptor, which is nothing but the same the deployment descriptor, but defined externally and referenced as the one that's going to be applied at the global level. So nothing new here. If you look at this deployment descriptor, it looks pretty much the same as what we would find at the project level or the k-jar level, the same deployment descriptor definition. But in here, actually, I've added the event listener definition. So for instance, here I've added a very simple test process event listener, which actually looks like this. It's a very plain, a dummy implementation with nothing much logic involved for each of the events. So it just prints out the specific occurrence of the event to the console. So we have this process event listener already part of the deployed key server as well. So I have just included this process event listener into the webinf lib of the key server var. So this will be available during the runtime. And so going back to the definition, so of the server level deployment descriptor, so we have referenced this particular event listener here. And after this, so once we have defined the global deployment descriptor, the next step towards making it available for each of the process instances that are currently active is to restart the key server with the reference to the global deployment descriptor. So now that I've started few instances of the process instances, we don't find anything getting logged here because there is no process event listener attached to it. Now I'm going to stop this key server instance and going to start it with the reference to the global deployment descriptor. So we have a system property called org key deployment DESC and location, so to which we need to specify the specific global deployment descriptor that we have defined. So this is the one. And what's going to happen now is once the key server is up and running, it will actually attach these event listeners to all the key containers that are running within the key server. Now that is actually going to be governed by different kinds of merge modes. So again, going back to the documentation, in the same section under the deployment descriptors, a very detailed explanation of the different possible values of the merge mode is also given here. And the default merge mode that is there associated with each of the key containers is merge collections, which means all the configurations that are there defined at the key server level, which is the global level, plus the configurations that are defined for the collections in the key container level or the kjar level would be merged. So that's why it's called merge collections. Basically the collections will be merged. So the collections here are typically these elements which are multi-valued, especially the event listeners, task event listeners, and so on and so forth, which supports multiple values. So these are the collections. So these elements from the global deployment descriptor would get merged onto the elements that are defined within the deployment descriptor at the kjar level. So in this sample project that we have, so now that we have restarted, we have to relog in. And so in the sample project, if we look at the deployment descriptor, which should come up in a moment, so if we have a look at that, we would see that it doesn't have anything defined. So let's go back here, deployments and event listeners. So we have not defined anything here. So what happens is, so this is an empty definition which gets merged with this definition that we have defined here. As a result, this event listener would have already got attached to this particular deployment which we have done earlier. So let's have a look at the process instances now. So again, we have the same old 3 process instances that are waiting for human intervention. So let's go back to the task inbox and act upon one of those tasks which are pending for action. So this is a very simple human task with no real business function attached to it. So let's just start it and complete it. So before I hit the complete, let's just go back to the console, because our event listener, process event listener, is going to put some print some statements into the console output. So just to see that we don't have anything as of now, because there is no process event that has happened so far, but the completion of the task is going to actually create certain process events. Now if we go back to the console, here we go. So we see the specific events, process level events that has happened has been really captured by that particular process event listener, and it has executed what we have asked it to do, which is basically to print the specific event name as what we have defined here. So actually with this approach, we can clearly see that we have not really done any redeployment of the k-jars, but with the usage of a central or a server level deployment descriptor, we are able to easily attach the process event listener to those process instances that are already in running state, so which could be a huge sigh of relief for situations where you have multiple or thousands of process instances that are currently in active state in an environment like production system. So this actually provides a very simple approach to manage this kind of a requirement where you need to attach the event listeners to those process instances that are already in running state without going for a redeployment. I hope this helps, and thank you for watching.